Thank you for organizing this meeting. I am really glad for participating in this meeting, and I hope that the session I'm going to moderate now will be a great ending to this today's meeting. We have from interventions and participants from Lebanon, Morocco, Sudan, and Tunisia. We have dear friends who will be participating in the session. Each will have the opportunity to contribute to this session. This session will have an open discussion based on the interventions and the discussions in previous sessions on the context, in addition to the tasks and missions of all actors. We will focus especially on the role of actors and the mutual responsibility, in addition to responsible accountability when it comes to development actors. We will also discuss the role of the private sector, civil society, in addition to the roles of social and civil society movements, in order to have a global perspective of rights and of the needs of people with special needs. Dear friends, I hope that we will enjoy the session. We have 1 hour and a half, so we have to seize every moment. Each speaker will have 10 minutes for his or her intervention. I will remind you once the time is up. I hope that you would abide by the time allocated to you, so we will have enough time for discussion with the rest of the participants. I will start first with my friend Mohamadieh. She's a legal consultant and researcher and the Third World Network. She used to be a researcher at the South Center in Geneva for 6.5 years as a policies consultant for non-governmental organizations. She is also working on her PhD in international law. She conducts exceptional research when it comes to investment law, corporate accountability, and international law for human rights. It is important also to mention that she works on the policies relevant to developing countries. She also focuses on disputes between investors and is a member of the UN Committee on International Law. Kenda Mohamadieh, please, you have 10 minutes. And we want to discuss with you the major trends and issues regarding the private sector's participation in development. And it will be beneficial to us to know to what extent the private sector assisted in overcoming obstacles of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are highly interested in these topics. And also, we want to know more about the participation of the private sector, contributions, and the frameworks of the private sector. The floor is yours. Thank you, Kenda Mohammed. Thank you, Mr. Anas. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. As for the role of the private sector and the relation with the state and the relation between the state and the private sector, especially with the current crisis, the discourse that we are used to for a long time especially with the Agenda 2030. This discourse on promoting the role of businesses or the role of private sector and foreign direct investment, this discourse is on the rise now, and we believe that it will be a source of discussion or a theme for discussion when we are brainstorming about ideas to get out of the crisis. This is due especially to the pressure exerted on the states and on public systems and the pressure to respond to the problems that were revealed by this crisis in our countries, especially the need to promote investment in services, in health services, and other public services. And the idea of public and the private sectors coordination and participation in order to get out of this crisis will be the source of a discussion, will be a theme that we will be discussing in the coming period. Our societies will be under a lot of pressure in the coming periods because our economies are considered and categorized as vulnerable or conflict-prone economies. This will exert further pressure on our societies, especially since a lot of advices are given to decision makers in our states. These advice, this sort of advice is usually on the need to attract foreign investment without giving enough attention to the ideas and to the mechanisms on how to frame these investments in order to enhance the development trajectory. What I can say is that we are over-focusing on promoting the role of private sector with a lack of interest in what we need, the working tools and the frameworks that we need to ensure accountability. This is a fundamental role. We should have this accountability to better link the role of the private sector to the development goals. Based on the current experience and the health crisis and pandemic at the global level, internationally, I believe there are not a lot of lessons shared. We can see that there is a lack of will and desire at the international level and at the national state levels to intervene to frame the role of the private sector in a manner that serves the public or the general context, the national context and public interest. There is a sort of attempt to leave the private sector on its own and to allow the private sector to put its profit margins as a priority at the expense of the general population. This can be seen when it comes to the development of vaccines. Vaccines were developed, produced, manufactured. However, their delivery was a failure. We failed in providing these vaccines to the general population, and the reason was clear. The reason was clear because we gave priority to intellectual property, which serves the profit margin of pharmaceuticals. So we gave the financial aspect the priority on the public interest, which is vaccinating the world's population, despite the fact that the majority of vaccines that we are using today were developed either by partnerships between research centers affiliated with state institutions and private companies, or developed by funding spent by public institutions or state funds which funded these companies to do the research, like Pfizer and Moderna. We will not delve into these details. So public funds were behind these innovations. And despite of that, there were no guarantees or conditions placed on these pharmaceuticals to make sure that vaccines and technology is provided on the basis of which vaccines were developed. So there were no guarantees that these pharmaceuticals will provide this technology to other parties who are capable of manufacturing this vaccine at a larger scale, which will allow the vaccines to be available to a general population and be available to everyone. This shows that there is no serious attempt at the level of states in general and at the level of international community to put a general interest, public interest, before private profit margins. If we go into into businesses in general and especially in the Arab region, we can see that around the world companies are affected. Major companies and smaller companies are being impacted. However, developed countries, industrialized countries, managed to fund, to support their own private sectors, especially in the US and Europe. I believe this will allow these countries and the private sectors in these countries to overcome this crisis better than the private sector or companies in our own societies. We can notice as well that in developed countries there is a lack of linking the support given to these companies and corporations and with any conditions to transform or change their conduct or how they practice their businesses to be more in line with the sustainable development or to confront the climate crisis. In Arab countries, according to researchers studying the Arab region, these studies showed that companies or corporations in the Gulf countries or oil-rich countries will be more impacted by this crisis than the rest of the Arab countries because of their connections with the world and the global markets and financial markets. For instance, the Dubai stock market, more than 50% of companies listed in the Dubai stock market will go bankrupt during this period of time. So we can see that there will be great changes in the Arab region, which will lead to focusing more on means to revitalize the private sector in these countries, while also taking into consideration linking the role of the private sector with given conditions at the level of the international at the international level. Some trends might not change after this crisis. Some of these trends concerns major corporations' capacity to extract great profits from the international economy without regenerating contributions in the real economy by creating new jobs or contributing to productive activities or enhancing innovation. Thus, there is a trend. There is a trend of multinational companies that are turning into rentier companies, managing to gain profits, much higher profits than they reinvest in their economies. The financial aspect of the international economy led to multinational companies whose strategies are linked to the financial sector, not to the real economy. So they depend on the financial sector. These are the most influential companies in the world. And the crisis showed us that these companies grew much more influence during this crisis. These are some of the problems that we face when it comes to the role of businesses and the private sector that will continue and more rooted in the coming period. What do we need? First, we need to move from move away from the discourse on the role of the private sector, this discourse that is basically unclear and not linked to mechanisms of implementation or ways to ensure a justice of the victims of these corporation violations. We need to move and focus more on how to build legal frameworks at the national and international levels to enshrine the corporate responsibility of businesses and the private sector, be it at the level of rights or the level of development. We also need to focus on a radical transformation when it comes to the relationship between the state and the private sector. States should utilize the institutional and legal tools available to them in order to create stability and the power relations between businesses and capital from one side and the governments, workers, and citizens, in addition to the different social classes on the other hand. Hence, the importance of on focusing on developing our discourse as civil society organizations to reconfirm the fact that the expanding space of the role of the private sector should be matched with an expanding space for the role of the state, and to ensure a dynamic connection between the role of the private sector and the development goals. Thank you, Mrs. Kinda. Thank you so much for this interesting intervention. The question of stability, the question of balance between the role of the private sector and the public sector will be at the core of the ideas that will be discussed by our colleague and friend, Dr. Adib Nehmeh, who is a specialist when it comes to combating poverty and now is working on the research for the Arab network, and we are partners, and he's also joining us for this session. As a consultant on sustainable development policies and also a consultant for ESCWA between 2009 and 2018, he also was a consultant for the UNDP in Beirut and a project manager for capacity building to put an end to poverty, a project shared by the UNDP and the Lebanese Ministry of Social Affairs. He also was a consultant at the Ministry of Social Affairs between 2004 and 2009. He started working for the Regional Office of the United Nations for Arab States. He worked on regional issues concerning poverty, in addition to other positions that he assumed and a lot of responsibilities that he assumed. Dr. Nehmeh will focus on the role of the civil society in ensuring balance and also ensuring balance with the other actors, in addition to discussing a major topic: how can the civil society organizations play this role in a more restrictive environment, and how can civil society play and take care of its development roles during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Adib Nehmeh, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anas. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, dear colleagues and friends. In light of the interventions today, especially Kinda's intervention now, Abdul Karim, Nabil, and even the interventions yesterday, you can remember also various interventions that were impactful. Roberto Vicio, who likened COVID-19 as aliens coming from Mars, or also Ziad's intervention, Rabia Nasser's intervention. So we managed to discuss a large number of issues. I believe today, when we talk about civil society's role, this platform on which we are working together as representatives of civil society, we are also discussing Agenda 2030 to evaluate in general the achievements on this agenda. What do we expect as a result? I believe it is natural to assume that we will conclude that there was a great failure. Even at the level of the technical indicators that were established, there was a complete failure. As we can see in the 2007-2008 crisis, which was blamed for not achieving the Millennium Goals, I believe the COVID-19 will be blamed today for not achieving the Agenda 2030, and also for the inefficiency of states, and also for the discrepancy and the lack of opportunities, lack of resources and statistics. What will be the stance of the civil society if we use all of these pretexts? We know what the problem is, and we have discussed this problem during the interventions. I will discuss the latest intervention in the existing system with this economic and civilizational approach and context. The problem is not related only to the economic aspect. There is a whole civilizational issue. The world in general is facing death because of the illness and intellectual property. So the world had to choose between combating or dying because of this disease, or protect intellectual property. So the world actually chose to respect intellectual property despite of the fact that a lot of people will die as a result. So common sense required a different response. However, the world chose profit and intellectual property. What can you say about sustainable development? What we heard today, and the contributions and interventions today and yesterday, we had a radical approach and a progressive approach. When we look into our own role, we should actually study our role in the context of this development. Development is a qualitative, comprehensive transformation. Development is not just limited to a few indicators here and there. Even Agenda 2030, it's called transforming our world, a sustainable development. If we are to talk about development, we have to talk about transforming the world. At the Arab level, at the level of Arab actors, we have also to think about transforming our region and transforming our states and countries. What do we mean by transformation? We mean a change. This change should be comprehensive and comprise all of the pillars and dimensions and the 5 Ps that are listed in the agenda, in addition to other aspects of development. So we have to have a stance on a number of causes and issues. First, we have to identify and determine that what we need to change and transform at the level of economy, social, at the level of society, politics, governance, and at the level of relations among Arab states and the world. We have to define also our trajectory, our path. Do we want a neoliberal economy? Do we need, or do we want civil society? Do we want what kind of society do we want? When you talk about civil society's role in development, in our own countries, development is likened to a renaissance. It is likened to a renaissance that happened at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It is a modernizing project that will lead to building democratic institutions, rotation of power, and also building a modern democratic state, which was the slogan and the revendication of the Arab Spring. So we need options and choices of independence and democracy. If we are to talk about the development role of civil society, it is modernizing and also a renaissance role at the regional level. Why is this role impeded? First, we live in neo-patrimonial states, far away from a modern democratic state. We are also living with a neoliberal economy, which is a complete the complete opposite of a productive economy. At the cultural level, we are also living in a patriarchal society, male-dominated society, which goes against modernization. If we are to talk about the system that we are describing, the rights system shows us or gives us a frame to find solutions to overcome these three obstacles politically through the political, civil, and democratic rights, and economically through economic rights, in addition to social rights of individual freedoms, cultural transformation, and cultural change. We can consider this one as the starting point that will constitute an end to the mainstream thoughts that we are combating today.
Civil society is about people, the movement of people, the Arab Spring that we have witnessed, the protest movements. If we're talking about that, are we talking about this civil society? Does this civil society, or is this civil society able is it able of inducing change? What's the program? We need a political program. We cannot have a non-political or an apolitical program. Because as it has already been said, the first step towards any change in our region is a political step, or goes through a political process. Can civil society organizations have a political agenda? Yes, this is necessary. What are the tools that can be used? This is the true problematic. The problematic related to the relationship between institutionalized CSOs that we belong to and the relationship to popular movements and social movements, because in our Arab region, we are witnessing protest movements, popular protest movements, not only social movements, and we should know whether we are part of these movements, whether we're contributors to these movements or not, what's the relationship with these movements, and how can we develop tools that can help us implement this political program. Can these organizations turn into political organizations? I don't have the answer to that. However, what I can tell you is that civil society organizations should have an agenda for political change, exactly like they should have a human rights agenda. Should we do something in light of this mainstream context or not? I think that we cannot say that no one has done anything, and the nature of our work gives us a certain margin of maneuver. This is why I think that we can have equality change, and we should be able to promote networking, cross-sectoral and cross-organizational networking, federations, syndicates, organizations work on the virtual or level in the virtual world as well. We need to develop as well policies. We need to develop as well our 2030 agenda. We need to know how to use this agenda. We need to develop our knowledge, promote our independence. Unless we do that, we won't be able to promote this relationship with the state and the private sector. And in this framework, we should know that the idea of development is based on something quite similar to utopia. So equality, complementarity, integration, is this real or not? Can this happen or not? We know that we have the state, we have the market, and we have the civil society, and we have at the middle of all that the partnership, development partnership. However, we need to increase or to crystallize, if you could say so, the viewpoint of civil society, so that it can be a more important contributor to that relationship. In light of all that, we cannot rely on on international community, and we cannot rely fully on their support because they have a ceiling, if you could say so, to what they can do. On the other hand, we cannot we cannot rely only on UN agencies as well. We know that we have trends in our regions characterized by tribal identities, perhaps some extremist trends, some violent trends. We have different groups that we see in our society. Regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot adopt the mainstream discourse. Of course, we should have a response to COVID. We cannot restrict freedoms. We cannot increase these restrictions. We cannot increase restrictions on freedom of economic activity. However, sometimes there is an over-marginalization of people, of persons, and we have a discourse adopted by neoliberal systems and institutions that is as bad as the mainstream discourse. So practically on the ground, in which environment are we working? We are working in light of wars and conflicts, for example, in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, or in theocratic or autocratic regimes, military regimes, such as Egypt and the Gulf regions. We're working in economic collapse situations such as Lebanon, instability such as Tunisia, some transitions or transitional systems such as Sudan or Algeria. We're living as well or working in light of certain sieges and blockades such as Palestine, some militia-controlled situations such as Iraq. So we're working amidst all these situations. What can we do? I think that we need to break our traditional way of doing things. I might sound a little pessimistic, but I call you to be optimistic. Thank you. Thank you, Adib, for your intervention. Thank you for talking about the ways ahead, if we could say so, or steps ahead that and the path that we can follow. Thank you for your intervention. I will give the floor now to our colleague from Morocco. He's a civil activist. He works mainly on topics related to people with special needs. Mr. Ahmed Berkia is the secretary of the network for people with disabilities or living with disabilities, and he has participated in many programs, nationally, regionally, internationally. Mr. Ahmed, it would be useful to talk about the nature of the relationships in light, of course, of the different actors and stakeholders, and how can we guarantee more accountability, more transparency, and more equity. These are all topics that are important to discuss. So in light of everything that has been said, you have the floor, Mr. Ahmed. Hello. I have a connection problem, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if you can hear me. So far, so good, Mr. Anas is saying. Perfect. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this panel. I would like to thank the organizers and the participants. I would like to thank all the colleagues, all the friends who are taking part in this panel. Regarding the topic that is being discussed and regarding the responsibility between social integration and the governance, and regarding the way we can guarantee accountability and transparency while promoting social integration and social equity. So I will give you some ideas about that. Allow me first to talk about some brief points regarding this concept of social integration, and regarding the different problematics raised by this topic among experts, specialists, and researchers. And in order not to delve into details related to definitions, I will tell you what I mean by strategies of social integration. So, when we talk about social integration, we mean policies, systems that should be global, comprehensive, holistic, that should aim at fighting discrimination according to clear mechanisms. The aim is to ensure rights, human rights, and guarantee human dignity while protecting people from vulnerability. Another thing, these policies should acknowledge the pivotal role of persons, of human beings who are at the center of all policies at all levels, whether at the drafting level, at the implementation level, or even at the follow-up and assessment level. Based on that definition, on that brief definition, I will be talking or giving you my viewpoint on this topic. I would like to stress on some major points, some major entry points to social integration strategies. I would like to talk about some common ground between these strategies and governance. We lost you, Mr. Ahmed. So we lost Mr. Ahmed. I guess he has a connection problem. So that we don't waste time, I suggest that we give the floor to the fourth panelist, if you don't mind, while waiting for Ahmed to reconnect. We're talking about different actors and stakeholders at different levels. There is a major actor and stakeholder in this level. I'm talking about trade unions, about syndicates. And we have today one of the most prominent figures, Mr. Mustapha Tlili, who is the Secretary General of the Arab Trade Union and the consultant for the Maghreb region for syndicates. He has been he was in 2007 head of the Europea project implemented in the region, and he is now in charge of the European Commission program implemented in Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan. Based on previous work in this level, and based on what we had said about the role of civil society organizations and civil stakeholders, we would like to give the floor to Mr. Mustapha Tlili to talk about the social dialogue in the region as a major component to guarantee sustainable development. To which extent is the region taking into account this priority? And what should be done to promote the work of trade unions in the region? Mr. Mustapha Tlili, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anas. I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting. Although the situation is quite difficult in Lebanon and in the entire world, you have insisted on organizing this meeting. Thank you. I might not be able to talk about everything within 10 minutes, but I will be raising the major points related to that topic. This session or in the beginning of that meeting, I listened to what Mrs. Zaina talked about. She talked about the financial crisis faced by Arab countries. True. The health crisis within few months has become an economic crisis and then a social crisis before transforming into a financial crisis. All Arab countries are facing these multidimensional crisis. We cannot, in this regard, but look at what's happening as well in Europe, Western European countries. And if we look at the ways European countries have faced the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath, and we notice that they have dealt with that crisis in an exceptional way. The European Central Bank allocated money, huge amounts of euros, to different members of the European Union, different European Union countries. This is how countries were able to overcome some obstacles. This is how different organizations and companies and even institutions were still able to pay for their workers, for their employees, and the money was allocated as well to to people, even those who are retired, so that these households and these persons can face the crisis. If we compare that to our situation in the Arab world, in our Arab countries, we would notice that we are quite in a desperate situation. We have deficits in our budgets, and our economies won't be able to recover anytime soon after this pandemic. In Europe now, for example, we have negative growth rates. So minus, for example, 10% in France. And in these cases, exceptional measures need to be taken. Unless exceptional measures are taken, it would be difficult for any country to be able to sustain its economic activity, knowing that this economic activity has deteriorated in many countries, in all the countries, and unless this is done, no companies can retain their employees. They would have to fire their employees. So this is why we're saying that we're facing exceptional times, whether in Europe or here. In Europe, they might have taken some steps or they might have faced the crisis through these measures. And in European countries, they might be able to recover. However, in our Arab countries, we do not have these means. And I don't think that we will be able to recover anytime soon, knowing that we were already suffering from crisis before the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, this health situation had many economic and financial repercussions. So, how can we face that situation? We are indebted, so we have debts. And what is the role of trade unions here? I think that trade unions and syndicates should exert pressure on countries, on governments, so that governments take the right measures to be able to get out of this crisis and break the vicious circle. It is very important to rethink the fiscal policies adopted in the Arab world and our Arab countries. Of course, we should think of fiscal justice, and we should take into account the more or the most vulnerable groups have perhaps gradual or proportional taxes, have taxes on wealth. We should as well exert pressure on governments because the assistance given should be given as well to employers who respect social laws and who do not fire their employees during these crises. The assistance should be transparent. Everyone, the public opinion, should know how the money is allocated, and assistance, as I said, should be allocated to persons that are respecting the rights of workers and employees. There are other things that we should tackle, other topics that we should tackle as well. In fact, we have partnerships with the European Union, and there is the European Bank for Investment, and in light of the assistance presented by that bank or by these institutions, there should be a complete transparency. Of course, we're afraid that governments might take advantage of this assistance of these funds and orient them wherever they want. We're living in our Arab societies, and we know how things are. We know how big families are treated. We know how people who have a wide network of public relationships are dealt with. Even the IMF that is going to visit Tunisia soon wanted not only to communicate and to hold meetings with the government or with government representatives, but as well with representatives from workers, employers, and this is something new. In fact, IMF might be more aware than the Arab governments of the importance of the social components. They know that without this integration of social institutions and social organizations, it wouldn't be possible to implement any successful project. So many civil society organizations are going to meet World Bank or IMF representatives. Trade unions can have their voice and can amplify their voice during that meeting. Another thing, there are many movements being organized currently, and it would be very useful for us to participate in these movements, popular movements. Some European trade unions are organizing similar movements, and they are raising their voice, asking international institutions, namely WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, to take specific measures in order to allow countries with limited resources, countries facing huge challenges, mainly in terms of COVID-19 pandemic aftermath, to use or to produce vaccines. So there is a petition being signed currently a petition published by these trade unions across the world in order to allow smaller countries to produce vaccines. Another thing, we're witnessing a new trend or another trend in Arab countries, and we don't see that in other regions and other continents, if you could say so. I'm talking about the way we're dealing with this crisis, with this virus. So how Arab countries are facing this crisis individually instead of promoting cooperation between them to face that pandemic. In other regions, we see how countries are cooperating on a bilateral level, on more than 2 or 3 levels, in order to face the pandemic. In Lebanon, in the region, we don't have that. We have different countries working individually, although there are many wealthy people that have many resources, and unfortunately, we see many stakeholders funding wars and conflicts and allocating funds to fuel wars instead of allocating funds to promote cooperation between countries. So oil producing countries, for example, that have potential, that have financial resources, should, for example, help Arab countries that are more vulnerable, that do not have resources. So this is how cooperation should be promoted among Arab countries. We should promote this sense of belonging to one Arab nation, to one Arab people. However, you don't have that. This is why, as trade unions, we should put or point our finger at the problem. So we should pinpoint our problem or this problem, and we should stress on the importance of cooperation between different Arab countries. I think that I've tackled all the topics I wanted to tackle. Regarding what Abdo said, Abdo considers that fiscal policies need to be reviewed so that our governments can have more financial resources collected from taxes, and so that our countries can face the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic at all levels, of course. We know that we have limited resources. Fiscal policies might be an internal solution. However, there's another solution at the global level that can be adopted. Civil society organizations and trade unions can work together. We can develop a plan, a work plan, and exert pressure and lobby international organizations that work in this field so that we can remind them that the Arab region does not have enough resources. We do not have the same resources as Europe. We do not have a central Arab bank, such as the Central European Bank, that can print currency. So in Europe, this is what they did. And they were able to allocate funds at a regional level in order to help different households, and they were able to escape inflation. And there were 3 billion euros that were allocated to partner or to member organizations. We do not have similar financial institutions. We do not have an Arab a central Arab bank, and therefore we do not have this capacity or these resources. Therefore, we are in a vicious circle. Even if we succeed in facing the COVID-19 pandemic before the end of this year, we will still have a social and an economic aftermath, or social and economic aftermath and repercussions. Tunisia, for example, will face challenges. Last year and this year, we have negative growth rates, and in the best case scenario, it will take us 2 to 3 years to be able to go back to the 2019 situation. Therefore, it is very important to promote partnerships and cooperations between the 2 banks of the Mediterranean, we will be facing the crisis perhaps before the end of this year. However, we will be facing dire conditions exactly like Western African countries. The assistance that was distributed or allocated to already vulnerable Arab countries are below average. And this is why we need to have an institutionalized solution. Civil society organizations, trade unions need to work together. We need to exert pressure on different entities in order to make sure that we can bridge the gaps in our region, so that we can alleviate the burden on people, and so that we can face the aftermath. We're now a small market for the European Union. However, in the near future, we will be facing huge challenges that will go on for years and years. However, other countries will be able to break the circle, get out of this problem, and replace our role. This is our view. I wanted to be practical. We are willing to meet all CSOs, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations that are aware of these topics and that are willing to work with us at this level. We are willing to work on joint petitions in order to send the right messages to the right stakeholders, in order to notify the public opinion and developed countries that they cannot treat the situation, they cannot find collective or holistic ways of bridging gaps unless we are involved. Thank you, Anas.
Anas, you're on mute. You're muted. Yes, I apologize. I was thanking Mr. Mustapha Tlili for his intervention and also for his observations and also his call for continuous cooperation with civil society organizations when it comes to expressing messages regarding the situation of trade unions. I am thankful for Mr. Mustapha Tlili for his intervention and his methodical approach. I wish that we will be able to work with our colleague who didn't manage to be with us and now and discuss the topic he was going to address in another session. In the last 10 years, at the social level, we have a growing number of social movements who have their own demands and also who might have sometimes political demands, and also cooperate with other political actors and working with some parties according to each actor's position at the social level. Now we have a guest who will inform us about Sudan's experience when it comes to social movements in this Arabic country. We have Mohamadieh, who is the head of the Economic Rights Group Studies Research in Sudan and member of ANND, and he will have, as I mentioned earlier, the opportunity to discuss the case in Sudan and the role of social movements in Sudan in the context of transformation and change, in addition to the context of achieving peaceful transformation. The floor is yours, Mr. Muhammad. Muhammad. I have a presentation. If you could share the screen. I need to share the screen to show you the presentation. Our colleague will share your screen. Mr. Ali, can you please zoom in so we can better see the slides? Or you can put it on full screen. I'm facing some technical problems. I'll try to fix them as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Mr. Anas. I would like to thank the organizers for this session and for inviting me to participate in this session. The topic I will discuss today is a case study, actually, that will cover the majority of the previous interventions, especially the intervention of Mr. Adib Nehmeh concerning the role of civil society organizations in addition to civil society organizations' objectives. Since the Sudanese revolution in 2016, we had a real experience and we had the test of the Sudanese society. We learned the advantages and disadvantages of the revolution. I have prepared a presentation of 10 slides that I will discuss briefly regarding the revolution in Sudan. The historical context in Sudan shows that we went through successful revolutions, however, failed transition periods. So the revolutions were successful, but the transition periods failed, such as the October Revolution in 1964 against the regime of President Ibrahim Aboud, 1985 against the regime of Ja'far Namiri, and 2019 against the regime of the Muslim Brotherhoods and al-Bashir. In Sudan, we usually talk about advocacy. So the civil society in Sudan managed to topple an authoritative regime, one of the most despotic regimes with a religious aspect. So one of the strengths of civil society organizations in Sudan is advocacy. However, of the disadvantages is that the civil society organizations in Sudan are not patient enough. They cannot persist for a longer period of time. This is one of the main problems. This revolution actually started 4 significant transformations that I will mention briefly and discuss in detail. The first transformation is a transformation from totalitarianism toward diversity and freedoms. This is what happened in December 2019. The second transformation is transformation from state of war to a state of peace. Third, transformation from a centralized system of governance to a federal system. And fourth, a beginning or a start in the transformation toward development. So we are in a transformation, in a transition that might be successful. And the civil society organizations are actually spearheading this transformation toward development. I will go into further details. When we talk about transformation from totalitarianism to freedoms, the most important aspect is cooperation and partnership and governance and ruling between the military and civilians. I believe this is a unique model in the region. We have a constitutional mandate, a constitutional document that shows and actually translates this partnership in governance between the military and the civilians. I believe this is a unique model. I cannot at this stage evaluate the success of this partnership. Perhaps it would be successful. Perhaps it will be successful and we will manage to get to the end of the tunnel and manage to get to the end of this transition period, which will be historic, or it might not. But we are in this place now, and we'll see what happens. So what are the challenges of this partnership between military and citizens? First, we have an ideological military institution. The military institution has a religious ideology. Since 1989, all of those who are accepted at the military academy in Sudan and who are now of the most prominent officials and officers are actually chosen and recruited by individuals or perhaps clerics, high-ranking clerics. So I believe that the military institution in Sudan had to take part or to accept the revolution, but were not actually very enthusiastic about it. Civil society in Sudan is actually facing some of these challenges. We have the civil society is divided into political parties, civil society formed by political parties and other organizations. After 30 years of repression, of lack of freedoms, civil society had to work behind the curtains. So getting or seeing the light at the end of the tunnel will require the civil society to be patient, to build capacities. It is actually interesting that civil society activists were aware of the weakness of the civil society now and actually called for a transition for years and negotiated with the military institution and ended up with a transition period of 3 years. A large number of political actors in Sudan are still attached to a political ideology that I could summarize as focused on headlines instead of context. Or in other terms, it's a political ideology that is not pragmatic, that does not take into consideration the general context, but deals with ideas that are already present, regardless of the fact if these ideas are actually in line with the context and the challenges that we are facing. The fourth challenge is the deep state. By deep state, I mean the previous regime, the regime of al-Bashir, and its control over civil servants. This deep state has control and direct control over the civil servants of the previous regime, be it directly or indirectly. This is clear when it comes to the lack of accountability and also the lack of order in the civil servants' order. The other challenge is civil state institutions such as the police and state security of the military ideology and dogma. These security regimes, these security institutions act as if they are the military. We move now to regional interventions and border conflicts and disputes. This is one of the main challenges, especially in the north of the country, because we have our disputes at the borders with Ethiopia. And we move to before the last challenge, which is the conditions for the peace agreement in order to organize the elections, which needs a constitutional conference, the return of all the internally displaced, and we are facing as well another challenge represented by the lack of a political representation. The other transformation is from the state of war to a state of peace. The context, signing the peace agreement in Juba on the 3rd of October 2020, challenges two of the biggest military militias or movements are still outside of the peace process, such as the popular movement, Abdulaziz Al-Hilo, and the Sudan Liberation Front, Abdel Wahid Noor. And therefore, they signed the peace agreement. Those who signed the peace agreement actually represent one tribe. It is one affluent tribe and actually a more influential tribe. Managing to ensure that armed forces are actually included and covered by the Sudanese army. I will try to be as brief as possible. Of the other challenges, financing the peace contributions, also the constitutional complaints against the legitimacy of the amendments of the constitutional document as a result of the peace agreement. Transformation in the regime from centralism to federalism, a context. Sudan had an undeclared federal system from 6 to 8 districts, and also there were a risk of sedition. Transformation toward development. This is one of the major points that I want to highlight and that are linked to the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals. Context, general context is that after the Sudanese revolution, the United States lifted sanctions on Sudan. We have a United Nations delegation and the interest of the international community. So this is the general context. However, the challenges are the following. These challenges we actually felt in the previous year, which is the lack of the philosophical dimension of the concept of development. What do we mean by a development? What I mean by that is that development in its philosophical aspect is a transformation from Bedouinism, from the rural area to a more civilized and city-based lifestyle. The lack of awareness and acceptance of the role of the state and the role of political actors. We are still postponing what should be done to the next year or the year after. This is what my colleagues actually mentioned. After the revolution, or the revolution actually was spearheaded by the trade unions. Please be brief. So the Sudanese revolution was spearheaded by trade unions. I believe there is a pyramid at the base of which we have trade unions and advocacy activists, followed by think tank or thinkers and brainstorming centers who produce knowledge, and the next level in the pyramid we have the political parties who are supposed to take the outcomes and results of these think tanks and turn them into policies to run the state. But we do not have a division of labor based on this pyramid. Lack of a clear political leadership. We also have a great reliance on the capitalist economy in the midst of poverty and inequality. Of the challenges as well, institutional reform, which is one of the most important challenges in Sudan. In Sudan, institutional reform is not the term that should be used, because it should be linked to the cultural and political context. You cannot have an institutional reform when you have a clientist state where the person is considered a client of the state and not a citizen of the state. We have to establish these institutions first. Of the challenges also is a lack of clear labor relations. Contributions, we need an education system, the purpose of which is creating a critical mind, a critical analysis, raising awareness on philosophical dimensions of the concepts of development, also enshrining the concept of accountability through detailed work contracts that show tasks and responsibilities, raising awareness on turning activists to a politician by accumulating expertise. One of the flaws is that those who were advocates want also to play the role of politician. There is no division of labor. We have to raise awareness on the need to labor division for the process of development, and also we have to organize civil society at the base level. I would like to let Mr. Adib Nehmeh know that we managed to tell trade unions that it is their duty to defend public liberties and freedoms. And trade unions were also spearheading the revolution. Thank you for Thank you so much for the time you have allocated me. I was so interested by your presentation, and I was so pleased to see all of the ideas that you mentioned. However, time is short, and we did not have enough time to delve deeper in the ideas you discussed, and we had to dedicate a period of time for the public discussion.